History is full of many strange and scary incidents. Some of the creepiest are those that you might not have heard about, but soon realized that if things had gone just slightly different, the world as we know it could have drastically changed. Number 10. There are many theories about potential wonder weapons that Germany was developing during the Second World War. What we do know for certain is that Germany wasn't able to develop a nuclear weapon. But that could have been very different if it wasn't for the actions of a small group of Norwegian fighters in 1943. Early in the development of nuclear technology, scientists realized that they needed some kind of substance to slow down the neutrons that are released during the splitting of atoms. During the Manhattan Project, graphite was used for this. But in Germany, scientists didn't have enough of the ultra-pure graphite that was needed. Instead of graphite, they used a substance called heavy water. In heavy water, the hydrogen atoms in the molecule have a neutron in their nucleus, as well as the typical proton. This makes them twice as heavy. Generally, chemical reactions are concerned with the interactions of electrons, so these neutrons don't make much of a difference chemically. But they do add to the weight of the molecule and make heavy water capable of slowing down the speeding neutrons created by nuclear fission. The problem with heavy water is that it's extremely rare. Naturally, less than 1 in a million water molecules are heavy water. They can be created through electrolysis, and the Vimork hydroelectric plant in Norway was the first and one of the largest plants to do this. While Norway was still a neutral country, there were many who sympathized with the Allied forces, including some officials at the Vimork plant. Before the German invasion, they allowed for the transportation of their heavy water reserves to France, but the plant was still in operation. That meant, after the invasion, this water could be used by the Germans for their nuclear ambitions. Allied forces wanted to simply destroy the plant in air raids, but the architecture of the building convinced them this was useless. The plant was built in a remote location on the side of a mountain, and the most critical infrastructure was buried deep underground. They would need someone on the inside to destroy the plant. A two-stage operation was planned. The first stage was Operation Grouse, which involved a small group of Norwegians to conduct reconnaissance around the outside of the plant, and to prepare for the British engineers that would actually conduct the sabotage. The second stage, Operation Freshman, involved 30 engineers and 4 pilots on gliders arriving at the scene to infiltrate the plant. Unfortunately, the 2 gliders crashed, along with one of the planes that were towing them. Everyone who survived the crashes was captured by German forces and met disturbing ends. A new operation was launched, Operation Gunnerslide. This time, a group of just 6 Norwegians were parachuted into the area. They connected with the 4 operatives from Operation Grouse, and then got to work getting into the plant. The plant was surrounded on 3 sides by a steep gorge, and the 4th by the mountain itself. This was also littered with mines and patrolled, as the unsuccessful Operation Freshman had alerted the Germans to Allied interest in the plant. There was one bridge across the gorge, but it was closely guarded. The group decided to scale down the gorge, cross the iced-over stream at the bottom, and then climb back up on the other side. They then followed railway tracks into the plant itself. They planted devices in the very heart of the plant and made their escape in the chaos that followed. All managed to get away, and the machinery used to create heavy water, as well as the stockpile of the substance, had been destroyed. It would take months for the plant to come back online, and Allied raids on the area convinced the Germans that it was not feasible to continue operations. What heavy water they had was to be transported via SF Hydro to Germany, but operatives from the same group that destroyed the plant managed to sneak in and plant devices there too. SF Hydro sank, and the heavy water remains at the bottom of Lake Tin. Number 9. Of all the diseases that have plagued humans, smallpox is one of the most famous, and one that stayed around the longest. In 1977, the last naturally occurring case of smallpox occurred. The only case after that was from a British laboratory accident. But a disturbing report emerged in 2002 that showed that the disease might not be gone for good. The report only came out in 2002, but referred to an outbreak in 1971 in a small fishing village on the Aral Sea. In Aralsk, a young woman had fallen ill with a mysterious disease. Her younger brother also later caught the same infection, but doctors couldn't figure out what it was. While he was sick, the boy's schoolteacher came to visit, and she also picked up this mysterious illness. The teacher seemed to be impacted more than the other two patients. At first, doctors thought she had measles, but they soon realized it was something much worse. Smallpox had been eradicated in the Soviet Union around 1960. The government had actually sent millions of doses of the vaccine to the World Health Organization when WHO began a campaign to eradicate it globally. So for a case to occur in the middle of this isolated area was extremely unusual and worrying. The young woman was determined to be patient zero. She was a scientist who'd recently returned from a research mission around the Aral Sea. She was studying fish and plankton in the waters and had been sailing on the research vessel, the Lev Berg. Officials tried to claim that she'd picked up the disease during stops at ports in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. This wouldn't make much sense, given that there were no cases of smallpox in either of these areas. Women weren't allowed to leave the ship at these stops, and Patient Zero had stayed on board. The reality was something much more sinister. The Lev Berg had sailed within 15 kilometers of an island that was home to a testing facility that dealt with some of the most dangerous diseases known to mankind. The facility here had been in operation for decades and was experimenting with using these diseases as weapons. Smallpox was one of these diseases, and it's believed that the disease was being experimented on in an airborne form as the research vessel passed. The woman spent more time on deck than the rest of the crew and was unlucky enough to have caught the disease. Considering the poor handling of other emergencies, such as the Chernobyl disaster, this could have been devastating if the outbreak wasn't handled properly. Luckily, in this case, strict measures were taken. Nobody was allowed to leave Aralsk, military personnel patrolled the borders of a quarantine zone, and a massive vaccination program was put into place. Only 10 people caught smallpox and 3 passed away, including the schoolteacher. But in less than a month, the disease had been eradicated again. The Soviet Union managed to keep the outbreak a secret until 2002, when a report made its way to the United States. There were worries that this might have been a resistant strain of the virus. Some of those infected had been vaccinated, including the researcher who became Patient Zero, but it was more likely that this was a strain that the world already knew about. It also started a discussion about whether vaccinations against this disease should be started again. While things have been dealt with swiftly on this occasion, it's creepy to think about what else might have happened that we don't know about, and how easily something even more disastrous could have taken place. Number 8. Spies have been a part of warfare for most of human history, but the amount of espionage and counterintelligence going on during the rise of the Soviet Union and the Cold War was at a level never seen before. But it wasn't only the number of spies on both sides that was surprising, but just how high up in various offices they were. Perhaps none were more surprising or had such a devastating impact as a group known as the Cambridge Five. The truth about this spy ring began to unravel in 1951. Roughly 20 years earlier, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess had been students at Cambridge University. Both came from upper-class families, and schooling at the prestigious university would have meant that they could get pretty much any job they wanted. Another thing they had in common was an admiration for communism. They believed that this was the best form of government, and when they were in a position to do so, they decided to pass over information to the Soviet Union. In 1936, Maclean began working at the Foreign Office. When exactly he started handling classified information to the Soviets isn't known, but he was considered a very important mole for them. This was despite the fact that he had a problem with alcohol and would sometimes let slip about his spy work. Either the people he spoke to decided to keep his secrets, or they didn't believe his ramblings. But by 1951, people began to get suspicious about Maclean. By this time, another Cambridge graduate named Kim Philby was the first secretary to the British Embassy in Washington, after serving for years as head of Soviet counterintelligence for the British Secret Intelligence Service, which would go on to become MI6. Philby was part of the investigation that would uncover McLean as a potential spy, but being in the US, he only got some of the information his counterparts in the UK had. For example, he knew that McLean was under surveillance, but would soon be brought in for questioning. He didn't know the exact date, though. But even this much information was disastrous when it turned out that Philby was also a spy. He was also very close to Burgess, so when he thought that McLean was about to be brought in for questioning, he sent Burgess back to the UK to warn McLean. Burgess and McLean both defected to the Soviet Union, and now the US and UK intelligence agencies were certain that both were spies. They also suspected Philby, but there was no evidence he was involved. For years, there were arguments between the Foreign Office and various British intelligence agencies surrounding Philby. MI6 defended him, where MI5 were certain he was a master spy. In 1961, a KGB agent defected to Britain and told authorities of a ring of 5. He listed Burgess and McLean as 2 members and claimed Philby was possibly the third. The arguments about Philby continued, while in 1964, 2 more spies confessed. These were Anthony Blunt, a former student at Cambridge who played an important role in recruiting other spies, and John Cairncross. Both had been suspected before and initially denied anything to do with the USSR, but now they confessed. Blunt was especially concerning, as he was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures. This would possibly be even more embarrassing than Philby's espionage if it got out. He was allowed to continue in his role even after confessing, and the Queen and Home Secretary were informed of this espionage, but it was kept a secret from the Prime Minister and the public at large. His role wouldn't be revealed until Margaret Thatcher discussed it in the House of Commons 15 years later. John Cairncross claimed to have only spied during the Second World War, when he passed over information gathered during his time working at the code-cracking Bletchley Park. None of the Cambridge 5 were ever prosecuted, and the fact that these men had such high-ranking positions led to strained relations between the US and UK intelligence agencies. Just how much information was passed over, and how damaging that was to various Cold War efforts, may never be known. Number 7. When we think of hunting to extinction, it's normally animals that come to mind. But during the Victorian era, a craze for exotic plants led to the extinction of thousands of species of orchids. It was called orchid delirium. Unlike the similar-sounding tulip mania, which was largely exaggerated for satire, orchid delirium had a serious impact on Victorian society and the world as a whole. Orchids are found on every continent except Antarctica. Ever since the Middle Ages, the flowers had been prized, but during the Age of Exploration, new exotic species of the flower were brought back from Africa and the New World. It started in 1818 when biologist William Swanson shipped back specimens from Brazil, which were described as having a vivid hue. Within years, there was a rush to get as many different varieties of orchids as could be found. It became a status symbol. These plants had not adapted to grow in the relatively cool temperatures of Britain, so the wealthy constructed greenhouses, or what were called stove houses, where fires would be kept burning constantly and all light was shut out. It was believed this would be enough to keep the plants thriving. It wasn't only the facilities that allowed people to express their wealth, though. People would hire orchid hunters to go on expeditions to unexplored areas to find new species. Other orchid hunters would go to these locations, gather as much as they could, and then sell the plants at auction for an extraordinary amount of money. Many would never return from their adventures abroad. Not only were there dangerous diseases, animals, and terrain to contend with, but orchid hunters would often get into fights with indigenous populations, or with each other. Orchids were so desirable that people drew weapons over them, and many lost their lives. But even the most expensive greenhouses didn't necessarily mean that orchids would survive. The Victorian collectors simply didn't know how to look after these plants. It wasn't just the heat that was a problem, but elements like the soil and even pollinators needed to be taken into account. Some orchids would adapt to only a single species of moth to be able to pollinate them, and these weren't brought back with the plant. That meant, unfortunately, that many of the orchids that were brought back to England would only bloom once, and their owners couldn't keep them alive. Collectors would try to replenish their greenhouses with new plants brought from the wild, but eventually many species of orchids could no longer be found in the wild. It's not known how many orchid species were driven to extinction, but many are still extremely rare to this day. Orchid delirium eventually died down. Biologists learned how to grow the plants from seeds, taking away the need for expensive orchid hunters. As they developed a better understanding of the plants, it was possible to keep the orchids that remained alive, and the cost of these plants eventually dropped to a more reasonable level. But orchid delirium still exists today. At Kew Gardens in London, orchids are kept under special security, as there have been cases of people trying to steal rare species that are under conservation. There's a black market for the plants, as selling wild specimens is significantly restricted. While orchid delirium had a lot of negative effects, it did lead to the science of botany being recognized as a serious science, and a much greater understanding of how flora adapts to the world around it. Number 6. Ever since the early days of the Formula One Grand Prix, the potential volatility of host countries hasn't been enough to deter racing. That was most shockingly seen during the 1958 Cuban Grand Prix, when the star driver was kidnapped by revolutionaries. The Cuban Grand Prix had started as a non-championship round of the series the year before, while drivers and teams used it to prepare for championship rounds and to earn prize money. For the Cuban government, it was a way to attract attention and wealthy visitors. Cuba's casinos rivaled those of Las Vegas, and it wanted to associate itself with the luxury that Formula One portrayed. The first iteration had been a success, but the politics of the island nation had changed significantly before the second running. Revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro were gaining momentum, with growing numbers of fighters camped out in the mountains. Their actions were often violent, although many claimed that Batista's regime portrayed them as more violent than they were. Despite this, the Cuban Grand Prix was set to continue, and the drivers arrived in the country in late February for the race. During practice, Juan Manuel Fangio set the fastest time and posed for photos with Batista. But the night before the race, the famous racing driver would disappear. It's believed staff members at the hotel where Fangio was staying tipped off members of the revolutionary group when their guests would be there. The evening before the race, Fangio was in the lobby of the Hotel Lincoln with friends when a revolutionary burst in and ordered Fangio to come with him. At first, the driver thought that it was a joke, but the kidnapper revealed that he had a weapon and said he would use it if anybody tried to stop him. The others in the lobby were told not to do anything for 5 minutes after the kidnapper left. Fangio was taken to a stolen sedan waiting outside and driven to a series of safe houses. He would later reveal that he was treated well, considering the circumstances. Fangio was taken to 3 safe houses where he signed autographs for others who were staying there and chatted with his kidnappers. According to him, they tried to explain their cause, but he wasn't interested in politics. What was of interest to him was the idea that the Batista government would try to make the revolutionaries look as bad as possible. The kidnappers claimed they had no interest in hurting Fangio, and later said that if he'd been hurt, it would have been extremely detrimental to their cause. The goal of the kidnapping was to embarrass the government, but also to show they weren't the violent thugs they were portrayed to be. They told Fangio that there was a chance that the government would take his life and blame it on the revolutionaries. In the meantime, there was a massive manhunt for the kidnappers, and the event made headlines around the world. It definitely got the group the attention they wanted. It didn't lead to the race being canceled, though. The event itself was a disaster, with multiple spectators losing their lives in an accident. The kidnappers allowed Fangio to listen to the race on the radio, and later watch reports on the accident on TV. After the race, he was taken to the Argentine embassy and released. Fangio asked ambassadors to tell news agencies immediately so that everyone would know that he'd been released alive. He couldn't help to identify his kidnappers, and nobody would ever be charged for the crime. The incident achieved the goals of the kidnappers, though. How much it helped the revolution itself can't be said, but by the end of the year, the revolution was complete and the Batista regime was no more. Number 5. Over the course of about 2 weeks in November of 1938, residents of the small town of Halifax, England, were gripped with fear due to an unknown attacker. The so-called Halifax Slasher seemed to appear from nowhere before attacking his victims and leaving them wounded. Despite many police hunts, he couldn't be caught. That was because he never existed. The first attack, attributed to the Halifax Slasher, occurred on November 21st. A young woman named Mary Sutcliffe was walking home from work when a man approached her from under a street lamp. He suddenly went to strike her, and Mary lifted her arm to stop him from hitting her in the face. The attack left her with a wound in her hand that needed stitches, but she wasn't seriously hurt. This happened just days after 2 women reported being attacked by a man with a mallet in a nearby town. While this attack wouldn't be attributed to the Halifax Slasher, it helped to add to the atmosphere of fear that was building up. A few days after Mary Sutcliffe was attacked, the Halifax Slasher struck again. This time, the victim was a man named Clayton Aspinall, who was struck in the head while he was at work as a caretaker for a local church. He described his attacker as a red-haired, stooping man. The police claimed that the attacker was an escaped maniac and put the local school on lockdown so that they could search for him. When no attacker was found, the search party escorted the school children home just to be safe. The first physical clue came with the next attack, this time of a man named Percy Waddington. Waddington was slashed as he walked home from work, but managed to tear away a scrap of fabric from the criminal's coat before he got away. The police later found the coat with a missing sleeve on a football field. This should have helped the police uncover the truth about the slasher. It would later be discovered that the coat belonged to Percy Waddington himself, and he'd faked the attack. But the case of mass hysteria continued, and for about a week, more people came forward claiming to have been attacked. Some had scratches that were obviously the results of falls or brushing against a rough surface. Others had wounds that were more serious. Some didn't have wounds at all, but were sent into a panic if they felt someone brush up against them in the street. Vigilante groups were sent to try to find the attacker. On at least 2 occasions, men who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time were accused of being the mysterious Halifax Slasher, and were set upon by the mob. The police had to escort these people to safety before they were seriously hurt. On November 29th, Percy Waddington admitted that he had faked his attack. Not long after, the police would issue a statement saying they no longer believed the Halifax Slasher to be a real person. Slowly, reports trickled in that other people had faked their attacks. One woman explained that she'd caused her wounds with a broken vinegar bottle and couldn't explain what had come over her. Today, it's believed that the first attack on Mary Sutcliffe was real, but the rest of the Halifax Slasher panic was simply a case of mass hysteria. Number 4. There have been many doomsday myths created throughout human history. Most are very obviously not true, but some are just realistic enough for people to believe, and continue to share them long after they've been debunked. That was the case for the bacteria, Klebsiella planticola, which supposedly almost ended the world. The bacteria, now called Rotella planticola, naturally occurs in soils around the world. It's a decomposer and helps break down plant material. But it made headlines in 1999 when there was a fear that this would be taken to the extreme. About a decade earlier, a German biotech company began experimenting with K. planticola. Their goal was to find a way to deal with crop residue, such as corn stalks and lumber waste. These plants can harbor dangerous pathogens, and the company wanted to find a way to break them down as quickly as possible. The previous practice involved burning the waste, which wasn't the best for the environment. K. planticola was a good contender for a replacement. The bacteria was modified with the genes for an enzyme added to the genome. Now this new genetically modified version could quickly ferment plant waste into ethanol. It left behind a sludge that could then be used as a fertilizer. Testing to see how effective this would be started out with sterile soil and seemed to be positive. But the idea of something genetically modified being added to the soil concerned some scientists. A group at Oregon State University, led by Elaine Ingham, studied the modified bacteria in normal soil. According to Ingham, when seeds were planted in soil with this bacteria, they wouldn't grow. It apparently destroyed the plant, as the bacteria produced more ethanol than it could stand. It also apparently outcompeted other bacteria, and according to Ingham, could lead to the end of all terrestrial plant life if this had been added to the soil outside of a laboratory setting. The findings caused a wave of panic, especially among those who already had a fear of genetically modified organisms. But it later emerged that the paper that Ingham cited didn't exist. Repeated experiments found that the amount of alcohol produced wasn't enough to destroy plants. The bacteria couldn't even survive in poor soil quality and were unlikely to have taken over the world, let alone end all plant life. Ingham issued an apology for making false claims about the impact of the GMO, but that hadn't stopped the doomsday story from being repeated in pop culture, and by anti-GMO activists decades later. Number 3. Victor Lustig is known as one of the most talented con artists to ever run a scheme. He had so many aliases and fake backstories that we don't know today what his real name was or where he came from. Lustig pulled off his crimes in the US, Mexico, Canada, and Europe, but his most famous con took place in Paris when he sold the Eiffel Tower. After scams in the US led him to flee to Paris in the early mid-1920s, Lustig got an idea for a scheme that would make him famous for decades to come. At the time, the Eiffel Tower's creator had recently passed away, and there were discussions about whether the tower was worth the cost of the upkeep. It had only been designed for the World's Fair in 1889, but had become a permanent feature in the center of Paris. But it needed a lot of maintenance, and there were discussions in the newspaper about the costs and public sentiment towards the structure. This gave Lustig an idea. He hired a master forger to recreate government stationery and researched everything he needed to know to take on his new identity, Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. Using the official government stationery, he wrote to scrap dealers in Paris and gathered them to a secret meeting in the basement of a hotel. There, he claimed that the costs for maintaining the Eiffel Tower were too high, and the government had decided to sell it for scrap. But the idea would be controversial, so they would need to keep the plan a secret until all the details had been arranged. The scrap dealers were invited to submit their bids, but Lustig had already chosen which would be the successful buyer. André Poisson had ambitions of rising the ranks of the Parisian business people. He knew that not only would the selling of the tower earn him a lot of money, but it would also earn him a lot of prestige. Lustig could see how enthusiastic he was and summoned Poisson to his office alone. Lustig then told him a new story about how being a government official didn't pay him enough for the lifestyle that he wanted. Poisson realized he was asking for a bribe and handed it over. He also paid his bid for the tower, which combined cost him about 70,000 francs. Lustig and his co-conspirators then fled France. He figured that Poisson would be so ashamed and embarrassed that he wouldn't go to the police. Just to be sure, Lustig checked the newspapers every day, but saw no news of his con, and he knew he was right. Not satisfied with selling such a famous landmark once, Lustig later returned to France to try to pull the same scheme again. The scheme was exactly the same, and he'd even selected the mark he was going to sell the tower to. But this time, the police were informed and he fled back to the US. Lustig continued to run cons for years in the US, but it was a banknote forgery that would eventually lead to his capture and his sentencing to Alcatraz. Number 2. There are many soldiers who fought during the Second World War with strange and unique stories. Few are as unique as Lauri Torni, a man from a nation with just as unique a role in the war as Torni. Torni was born in Finland in 1919, just 2 years after the country gained its independence from Russia. Like a lot of young Finns at the time, he opposed the Soviet Union and would do everything he could to fight against it. That began with a stint in the Finnish army for the Winter War, which started when the Soviet Union invaded in November of 1939. Torni gained prestige through his actions during the war. his ability to infiltrate the Soviet forces and to lead troops even when he didn't speak the same language as those under his command. He was also able to encircle larger forces with his own small group. By 1941, Finland wasn't the only place the Soviet Union was at war with, and Finland found itself the unusual ally of Germany. Torni traveled to Germany for special training, and would end up fighting as part of both the Finnish and German armies to try and take back Finnish land occupied by the Soviets. Eventually, Finland would enter a peace deal with the Soviet Union, but Torni was one of many Finns who weren't going to be left unprepared if the much larger Soviet Union decided to go against the deal. He trained as a resistance, preparing for a possible invasion by Russia. He traveled to Germany to take saboteur training, only for the war to reach its final days while he was still there. Torni decided to see out the end of the war in Germany, then surrendered to the British. He was held in a British prisoner of war camp for a short while before escaping, something else that Torni would become famous for. He was captured and imprisoned multiple times over the next few years, including in Finland, where he was found guilty of treason for joining the German army. But each time he would make his escape. The Finnish Prime Minister eventually pardoned him in 1949, and Torni began his post-war life. Finland was hit hard during the war, and a lot of territory was lost to the Soviet Union. On top of that, they were paying repercussions, and there wasn't much work for Torni. He traveled to Sweden and then boarded a boat to Venezuela. He stayed in South America for a time, but he was still restless. Torni wanted to continue his fight against the Soviet Union, and the USSR's new enemy was the US. He wasn't allowed to enter the US, but did get a job on a ship that docked at various American ports. As he wasn't able to disembark the normal way, he chose to swim ashore. After arriving in the US, he traveled to New York and was welcomed by the Finnish community there. Torni's abilities in war, not just as a fighter, but as someone able to take part in special operations, were relatively well known. So when the FBI finally caught up with him for entering the country illegally, they were convinced to allow him to join the US Army. Around this time, he changed his name to Larry Thorne, and in 1954, he began training at Fort Dix. He excelled and joined the Special Forces, where he took part in many of the proxy wars being held between the US and the USSR. Thorne would serve multiple times in Vietnam and be awarded the Purple Heart for his valor during battle. It was in Vietnam where his life would finally end. By 1965, Thorne was part of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. It was part of a special operations unit focused on unconventional warfare, and in October of that year, Thorne was part of a clandestine operation searching for the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The helicopter he was on board crashed, and all aboard were lost. His remains wouldn't be found until 1999, and in 2003, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Number 1. In February of 1856, the families of 186 people aboard the SS Pacific waited anxiously for news of the missing ship. Months passed, and while newspapers tried to remain hopeful, they came to sad conclusions that those aboard would never make it to their destination. More than 160 years later, what happened to the ship and where it is now remains a mystery. The SS Pacific was part of the Collins Line, an American shipping company that transported passengers, cargo, and mail across the Atlantic Ocean. She was a wooden side-wheeled steamer propelled by 2 engines and auxiliary sails to achieve a speed of 12.5 knots. The Pacific had room for 200 first-class passengers when she launched, and space for 80 second-class passengers would later be added. She had 3 sister ships, the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Baltic, and together they were some of the most advanced and luxurious ships of their day. The Pacific had even briefly held the blue ribbon for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic, before being beaten by the more powerful Arctic. The Collins Line was supposed to be in competition with the British Cunard Line, and it looked like that was a success. But in 1854, it made disastrous headlines after the sinking of the Arctic. Despite the negative press from this, the remaining Collins Line ships continued their journeys between England and the US. The Pacific would sail between Liverpool and New York, and had made many successful trips when she too went missing at the start of 1856. The ship was last seen leaving Liverpool on the 23rd. There were only 45 passengers on board, which wasn't too unusual for the winter. The Pacific was designed with comfort in mind and had measures to stop passengers being hit by sea spray, but it was still not a journey that would have been pleasant. There were also 141 crew members on board and thousands of dollars worth of cargo. The captain was considered to be more than capable of handling the transatlantic voyage. Asa Eldridge was a Cape Cod skipper who'd been working on ships for most of his life and had navigated the route from England to New York countless times before. The chief engineer was new and unfamiliar with the Pacific's engines, but this shouldn't have been too much of a problem. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary when she set sail, but she would never make it to New York. Newspapers at the time talked about other ships that had gone missing for an extended period, only to be found with everyone on board in good condition. There was hope that this would be the case for the Pacific. Unfortunately, some also brought news from other steamers traveling in the North Atlantic, who reported seeing cabin furniture among the icebergs there. They couldn't be certain if it was from the Pacific, but it was an ominous sign. Nothing definitely from the Pacific was ever found, but 5 years later, there was an unusual addition in the case. On a remote island in Scotland, a bottle was found washed ashore. It contained a message written on a scrap of paper from a pocketbook. The message read, "On board the Pacific from Liverpool to New York. Ship going down. Confusion on board. Icebergs around us on every side. I know I cannot escape. I write the cause of our loss so that friends may not live on in suspense. The finder of this will please get it published. W.M. Graham." A search of records found that there had been a William Graham aboard the Pacific when it disappeared, and it was likely that this message was from the disappeared ship. In more recent years, some have claimed to have found the sunken vessel, but officially it remains missing, along with all those who set out from Liverpool on that cold January day. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.